Please summarize your chosen approach to family therapy.
My chosen approach is narrative therapy. It's a postmodern therapy. It was developed by Michael White and David Epstein. Um, the premise of this theory is that people in our lives, we create a story. From these stories, however, dominant and local discourses, which are societal norms, cultural norms, subcultural norms, influence our stories and create problems. Well, in this theory, there's a collaborative approach created or done by the therapist and the client, and there's no hierarchy. It's exclusively collaborative to help the client separate the problem from the person throughout a process called externalization. Now, through this process, um, as it's collaborative, the client, however, is seen as the expert, and the therapist is perceived as a co-author or co-editor of these stories. And through these stories, they focus on eliminating or removing the problem from the client's life and or story. Questions that are asked by therapists are not used to direct the therapeutic process, but rather to generate or create an understanding of the person's stories. Um, the externalization process, or the process of separating the client from the process, is not imposed by the therapist, but rather it's done through dialogue or influenced, um, not in a negative way or through imposition, but to where the client kind of gathers an understanding of how the problem is separate. And they do this by also naming the problem to where it creates a separate entity from the client. A unique aspect of this therapy is that the therapist um, writes a summary of the session. And also in the end, they also have an award system which provides a tangible item that the therapist can use to help facilitate future change with the client.
What makes your chosen approach distinct from other approaches to family therapy?
A few things distinguish this therapy from other family therapies, in that one, the DSM isn't a huge influence on the therapeutic process, because it separates the person from the problem, so it doesn't label the person saying this is who you are and this is who you will be. It's not perceived as a disease. To be frank, it separates that person and gives them a separate identity, and also gives the problem a separate identity. Another thing is the award system um, that gives the client, like I said, a tangible um, item that they can use outside of the therapeutic process to facilitate future change, and also let the client know that they do have the ability to change. So it kind of is helpful in their future, and also understanding that they do have that ability to make that change.
Can you describe any key interventions associated with this approach?
One of the key interventions with this approach is the externalization process. The externalization process is basically separating the person from the problem, and the emphasis on it is that you focus on understanding how the person influences the problem, and also how the problem influences the person. It doesn't have a actual standardized process. It's very specific and personal to the client. So this isn't necessarily done in 2 sessions, 3 sessions. There's no actual standard number of sessions that this externalization process happened. It also includes naming, as I mentioned before, the problem to where it fully becomes separate in the client's head. And this process is key in helping the client recreate or re-author their stories in a more fully functioning, positive, and productive way, to where they see it separately and it not being a part of them, um, as I mentioned before.
What drew you to this approach personally?
What drew me to this approach personally was one being the influence or the understanding and acceptance of how the environment or diversity um, can influence the person, the client change, but it's very important in the therapeutic process because it's also understanding that person from different perspectives. It's not really just kind of seeing that person um, as their problem. Also, the not labeling. I think that once you label someone, they kind of live that lifestyle because they see, oh, this is who I'm supposed to be. This is what I'm supposed to do. And when you label people, they follow that. But when you don't label and you say, hey, this is not who you are, this is just imposed on you by, how you were raised and all those environmental factors, that the person has the ability to make that change. Another thing that I think is important is perceiving the client as the expert and not the therapist. I think it's important that the therapist stays or uses a collaborative approach because the person's biological and also environmental factors make that person unique from anybody else. Um, with whatever they've gone through, there's no one person that is alike. There's a lot of similarities, but just because there's similarities, it doesn't mean that this person is going to be influenced the same, or is going to progress the same, is going to um, change basically the same from someone else.
Can you give a case example in which this approach proved to be useful and describe how it was useful?
One case example is substance abuse. And so, I mean, a lot of people say AA, it's not really an expert or therapy process, but it has that disease factor in that this is who the person is. They have this disease. They will always have it. Well, through narrative therapy, they can say, well, this is how these, were influenced. This is how these factors influence this person's life, but it can be eliminated. We can externalize. This is not who this person is. This has become a person that's a part of this person's life, but it's distinct. It's not the same. This is not how this person has to be for the rest of their life. This is not who they're going to be. It's not a determining factor from this person.
How would you describe this approach in one sentence?
I would describe this approach as very postmodern. I guess I would describe it as a futuristic, non-labeling approach.